Good morning, family. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 today. If you have not picked up on it so far, Corinthians has a lot to do with kind of how we should be interacting as a body. It talks a lot about our our community, right? Whereas when we studied Romans, it was a lot more personal. How we as people address God and interact with one another. Corinthians is a lot more community based. So think of it more of how we as a church should present ourselves and react to one another. In chapter 2, he goes into this explanation. For those of you that weren't here last week, he goes into this explanation of the difference between spiritual understanding and a natural understanding. And those that are spiritual will understand the things that are spiritual, and that those who are natural can't do so. He makes a statement that spirit is truth and wisdom, or that it is what pursues truth and wisdom. And he asks the question of who can understand God, and his response is only those who have been given God's Spirit can understand God, because only the Spirit can understand the self. In chapter 3, he's going to talk about the need for maturation, and we go to this chapter. This chapter's talked about a lot, the whole milk versus meat thing, and we kind of just stay at that first part of the chapter. We don't really talk about the rest that much. So we're going to put it back into context this week. He says, "And I, brethren, could not speak to you as to spiritual men, but as to men of flesh, as to babes in Christ." So you see this previous statements that he's made of the difference between those who understand spiritual things and those who understand natural things is him building up in order to tell them that's not you. You know, so he's actually in a method of correction at this point. This isn't meant to be an encouragement or a well done. He's telling them, like, you have a lot of work to do. Right? Spiritual men understand God because God is spirit. You, however, are not, and therefore cannot. That's not a very encouraging thing to hear, is it? How many of you would enjoy me getting up here and just telling you that you're all immature Christians? You're not ready for what I can teach you because you're just not there yet. There's no way you could possibly understand God. That's essentially what he's told this church. We don't usually put that into context when we talk about meat versus milk. But it's not you guys should mature so that you can handle meat. He's saying, you guys are incapable of understanding God because you're so naturally based. And I'm having to spoon feed you this stuff. I'm having to give you the most basic essentials because none of you are capable of handling anything else. He is not being lighthearted. He is not being gentle. And this is not a friendly letter. For any of you who thought that it might be, it is not. Paul is not writing to the Corinthians as a, hey friend, it's been a while, how are you doing? He says, I gave you milk to drink, not solid food. For you were not yet able to receive it. Indeed, even now, you are not yet able. For you are still fleshly. For since there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not fleshly? And are you not walking like mere men? I want to think about, first of all, jealousy and strife. When we talk Bible, right, it's easy in this setting, right, when there's a preacher up front and we're in the scriptures, to look at jealousy and strife and be like, oh yeah, they're horrible things. How tolerant are we of them, though? I mean, really, how much do we tolerate those two things in our life? Do we actually elevate it to the level of sin that we do other things? I'm certainly guilty of jealousy as much as anybody. I've looked at what other people have in their lives and what they've accomplished, and I've resented it almost, been envious of it, wished that I had those things. And Lord knows there's people in this room that I've experienced strife with, that I haven't always gotten along with. Come to an elders meeting, you'll see it. No, we get along mostly at elders meetings. But I want us to consider how many sins do we look at? They're absolutely horrible. Would we allow somebody to commit murder and then still fellowship with us and not have anything to say with it? We're just okay with them living a life where they murder people? Would that be okay with all of you? It's okay to interact with me here. No? What about homosexuality? Got a couple of homosexual couples that come in here, and I'm not saying you got to be hateful, but how many of us would be okay just, oh, that's cool. They're Christians like us, and we don't have anything to say about it. We're okay with this. No? How come we never correct each other for speaking out in jealousy, though? How come when we don't get along with one another, there's not a conversation going on? Why are we suddenly tolerant of these things? I'm only pointing out that this letter's being written to a church as a strong corrective measure. There is something wrong with this congregation. He's writing to them to try to help them fix it. And I'm only pointing this out because sometimes we look at these letters and we think, oh, this isn't us. We're not in this situation, but we really are. We struggle with the same things these first century churches did. But I want to point out something else that he says, this phrase that he uses. In verse 3, he says, are you not acting as mere men? Now, if that means nothing to you, mere men is actually a very powerful phrase. It speaks to the inferiority of man. And it also carries the implication that the person being talked to ought to be more than that. Right? We live in a world where we struggle so much that being a man is as good as you can get. I mean, most of the time, the best compliment a guy can get in nowadays is to be called a man's man. And here Paul's telling you that there's more than that. That's the lowest. That's the bottom. That is the bare minimum requirement for somebody that knows God, to be just a man. We struggle so much with foundational things. So when we read these letters, we got to be careful not to make ourselves out to be elevated above them. Like, oh, well, we have these writings and we've had thousands of years to work on this stuff and practice this stuff. And these issues aren't the same issues we deal with. The circumstances might change. Some of the details might change. It might be a little bit more nuanced. But at the core, we struggle with the same fundamentals that the church in Corinth did. So if you recall in chapter 1, he writes this initially to talk about the disunity in the congregation. He talks about those of you who say that you follow Apollos and you follow Paul and you follow Peter. These things shouldn't matter because we didn't die for you. We came to speak about Christ and the fact that he was crucified. So he's going to go back to that here in verse 5. He says, what then is Apollos? And what is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, even as the Lord gave opportunity to each one. Now I want to point out, do any of you guys have your Greek interlinear Bibles? Sam, did you have yours with you? Okay. This is one of those times where I've got to correct some phrasing that the translators use. The word in Greek is not servant. It is slave. It is doulos, which is slave. And I point this out because there is a nuanced difference between the two. Servant carries the idea that this is voluntary, that this is a job. Slave is a life. Slave is somebody that this is who they are, this is what they do. They do what they're told because they're told to do it because that's who they are. There's a nuanced difference between a servant and a slave, and I think it's important to point that out. That oftentimes English translators translate it to servant to make sure that the scriptures aren't offensive, and I think that's a horrible mistake. Because it carries a certain weight in this context, doesn't it? He's saying, who's Apollos? Who are these people you say you follow? They're nothing but slaves to the person you're supposed to be following. Why are you so focused on the slave? Do we do that today? Well, maybe. We don't really say, oh, well, our church follows the teachings of Paul. Our church follows the teachings of Peter. But how many of us have decided to attend a specific congregation because of who teaches there? Or who leads worship there? How many of us have decided to attend a specific congregation specifically because of who the elders are? Not because of how good they do, but because of who they are. Right? We like to be associated with reputable people. Right? It elevates us. It makes us feel good when we get to rub shoulders with people that the public sees or people see as important, doesn't it? It's okay to admit this, guys. That's what we call starstruck. Right? That's why people like going to concerts. That's why people will pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars more for backstage passes where they get to meet the band. It makes us feel good to know important people. But there's no one important. None of us are more important than anyone else. In the grand scheme of our faith in God, we are all either slaves to Christ or slaves to our sin, and there's no other category that we can belong to. Why would you elevate a slave? Why would you follow a slave when the master is there being offered to you? And this is what he's saying here is just follow the master. Stop worrying about which slave you learned from. Because that's all they are. They're just a tool that you were allowed to learn from. In verse 6, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So then neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, but each will receive his own reward according to his own labor. How many of you have ever worked on a farm or were family members to somebody who were farmers? Okay. How many farmers think that they survive on the sweat of their own brow? Almost none of them. If you really get down to it, most farmers are very spiritual on some level. Because whether they make profit or make loss in any given year centers solely on the grace of God and whether the crops grow and hopefully there's no natural disasters that shred their fields that year. And that's all he's saying here. You planting this, oh yeah, it's work. But that crop isn't yours. You're not the one that did this. You don't get the glory. You don't get the credit for the end product. The one who made them grow does. Because the fact is, you can plant all the seed you want, and it has no value if nothing happens to it. Those of us who call ourselves Christians, we're called to do labor, but we aren't given the credit for the labor. We shouldn't be glorified by what job we do. We shouldn't be glorified by how many people we bring to Christ. That's just the work that we do. All of that is to the glory of God because He's the one that set it up in the first place, and He's the one that makes it productive. Right? If God doesn't bless the work you're doing, it's going nowhere real quick. That's the nature of spiritual work, right? It relies on spirit. And you're not a part of the kingdom work, that spiritual work, unless you have the Spirit of God. So it all is this big circular motion where it all comes back to God. So there is no man that is meant to be elevated above anyone else. I am no more necessary to the church than the person who comes and cleans the church, or the person that makes sure that the church has money to pay the bills, or anyone else that attends this congregation. There is no greater value in one than the other. This is something the secular world can't understand. You ask who the most important person in a company is. Who is it? Well, it's the owner, isn't it? Or the CEO, or whoever the top person is, however you've set up the company. But it's the top dog, right? Except, how long does that company last when there's no workers? How many customers do they get if there's no one cleaning the stores? Right? He needs the people below him, or else he has no company. He's just a man who's decided he's important. Likewise, the workers would tell you that they're the most important people because, well, without us, nothing would get done. Except, who set this up? Who designed this? Who brought you in and gave you a job and made sure you knew what you were doing? You certainly didn't walk in the doors and decide to just start boxing things up, did you? That would be called a thief, for those of you that aren't aware. You see, I'm a big proponent for the church should never operate as a business. We should have absolutely no reflection of corporate anything in the church. That is not what the church is meant for. But if you're going to make the illustration, the one thing that the world could not understand is the nature of equality. It's something society has struggled with for a long time and will continue to struggle with. You know, whether it's racial problems in society or gender problems in society, everyone's crying out for equality, but nobody actually knows what that looks like. And most people don't even know what it means to desire that. It's very rare, but really mostly it's the Christian that understands the nature of equal value. And that the job doesn't actually dictate the value. That it's the person who assigns value that decides what the value is. Right? And that's God. What are you worth? It's not for me to decide. Right? Your value is dictated by the one who created you. And the one who created you decided that you were worth his life. Do you understand that? God, your creator, decided that you are worth the lifeblood of his son, the suffering of his son. You are worth these things. There is nothing that can change that. There's nothing greater than that can actually affect it. What you end up doing in the grand scheme of things does not change the value. What position you hold doesn't change the value. How many people that know your name doesn't change the value. Because the value is set in stone the minute that the creator of the entire universe decided what you were worth to him. So who is Paul? Who is Apollos? Who is Dave Engel? Or Dan Bruns? Everyone's just a slave. We're just the people that are given the opportunity to share something that was shared with us. Verse 9, for we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. According to the grace of God, which was given to me as a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building upon it. But let each man be careful how he builds upon it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if any man builds upon the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. How many people here are comfortable getting up in front of the congregation and leading singing? How many people have made comments on which song leaders they like and don't like? It's okay, I don't actually expect you to volunteer that information, but I want you to consider it. Those of you that mentally raised your hand at the second question, did you raise your hand at the first? How many people go to a congregation and assess the quality of the preacher? How many of them are willing to get up and preach? How many people would assess the quality of work of somebody that they have no business assessing because they can't do what that person is doing? Practical terms, it's a lot like this weekend, Bailey's brother and father, they do electrical work in Branson, and Bailey's decided that she wants to switch from a gas stove to an electric. Now, for those of you that don't know this, and for those of you that are aware, that means you've got to run all the new wire, right? That means you've got to install a plug for the new oven, because an electric oven takes 240 volts, which a gas oven doesn't have. So that means you've got to buy a breaker, and you've got to run a big old cable all the way through the house to that breaker box. I have no business telling her brother how to do the electrical work that he does all the time that I don't do. Does that make sense? Right? If you call a plumber to your house to fix a leaky pipe, you don't have any business telling him how to fix the leaky pipe. You called him because you couldn't do it. Right? You don't take your car to the shop and then tell them, well, I think you've installed that incorrectly and you need to do this in a different order. You're not qualified because you were unwilling to do it. But we do that all the time, don't we? We try to assess the quality of another man's work based on our own criteria and standard. But Paul here, he's writing to the church in Corinth. He's like, I don't know, there's no reason for you to worry about that. We're all trying to build the same thing, right? And we all might use different materials, but we don't need to bother with assessing the quality of another man's work in this kingdom, because at the end of the day, the fire is coming. And either a man's work is going to burn up because he used the wrong materials, or it's going to stand firm. At the end of the day, the quality is going to be revealed by that fire. It's going to be revealed by God. We don't need to waste our time trying to assess everybody. There's been many great ministers and evangelists who've lost their job because they went to their yearly meeting and they didn't baptize anybody new over the last year. It's been 52 weeks and we hired you to baptize people. We hired you to bring people into God's church, didn't we? How does that work? How does that make sense? How many people have you baptized for you to assess this man as unqualified or underperforming? Most of you guys have worked as middle-class, blue-collar workers, right? I don't have a whole lot of corporates here, right? Hopefully not. They're not going to like this next part. How many of us appreciate having a boss that's never done our job that tells us how to do our job? We love that, right? I worked at DZ. I did powder coating. This was right before I went to school for preaching. My boss knew absolutely nothing about powder coating. I have no idea why he was the supervisor over the powder coat line. He'd never done powder coating ever. And it was the most frustrating thing ever when he would come up to the powder coat room and try to tell me, you need to push your guns in, or you need to change your powder levels, or you need to increase your voltage on these guns. Dude, you've never done this job. There is no reason for me to believe you have any idea how to do this better. Right? That's how most of us think when somebody unqualified tells us how to do something. And here in the church, we have that problem, don't we? Practical, right? How many times have we had an activity or an event, or have you seen a church put on an event and somebody complains about how it's done? Or somebody talks about how it could have been better. But that person was never involved in the organization or execution. They weren't the ones that stepped up when volunteers were asked for. And typically, the ones that do step up are the last people to complain about what happened. Be concerned, is what it boils down to. Be concerned about whether we're being effective, whether we're getting the work done, whether we're doing good work for the Lord. But make sure your assessment is for yourself. You don't need to spend all the hours of your day worrying about whether this person is doing a job or whether that person is doing a good job. God is going to decide that one way or the other. They're going to have to stand on the quality of the work that they did for the kingdom before God himself and give an answer. You don't need to worry about it at that point, right? Do you not know that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become foolish, that he become wise. Now, here's that circular talk that happened in the last chapter, isn't it? Well, if you think you're wise, then become foolish so that you can be wise. Makes a whole lot of sense, right? But to those of us that have discerned truth, and those of us that have read chapter 2, we understand what he's saying. Because in chapter 2, he talked about this, right? The gospel is foolish to the people of the world that consider themselves wise. And it's the wisdom of God. If you think you're wise in the ways of the world, allow yourself to become foolish and be wise in the eyes of God. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God. For it is written, He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the reasonings of the wise, that they are useless. So then let no one boast in men, for all things belong to you. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, all things belong to you. And you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. Do you see the network of relationship that you've been called into? How many of us have felt alone on this walk? How many of us feel alone because we don't feel the support we need, or we're not getting the encouragement we need, or we care about something that no one else seems to care about? How many of us have come to church with 50 to 60 other people and felt completely isolated? How many of us actually feel connected with the people who worship alongside us? The wonderful, awesome thing about the way that God sets up his people, his church, is that we all stand on an equal footing, and our relationship with one another is only based on the person we have a relationship with. Meaning we all have our relationship with Christ, and our relationship between us is only based on that one thing. I mean, you think about it, right? And this might be difficult for some of you that have been worshiping together for, since dirt was invented, but think about this. How many of us would actually know one another or talk to one another or be even friends with one another if we weren't Christians together? I would certainly not know any of you. None of you were running in the circles I ran with back in the day. How many of us would actually know each other? All of us only have a relationship because Jesus is. Does that make sense? So then, if Jesus exists and our relationship is based on Him and Jesus is God and the Spirit of God is in you, right? So we're running backwards through this chapter. The Spirit of God is in you because you're the temple of God now. Then that means God lives in you and all things that belong to God also belong to you because you're now His children. And now the words that Paul doesn't say, you are heirs. All of this is your inheritance. It's been given to you long before its time, but it is the thing that's been left to you. It may not feel like it, but the world is your inheritance. How many of us have squandered it? Or said, well, the inheritance doesn't look the way I want it to, and so we don't appreciate it. God gave the world for His people. Do you understand that? The world was not created to be a trial. The world was not created to weed through the people that really loved God and those who really didn't care that much. The world was created to be given to man. God created the world so that He could put man in charge of it, and that's what we read about in Genesis. Right? He creates Adam and He puts him in charge of the entire garden. He says, you're going to name everything. You're going to help everything. You are in charge here. God designed man and He designed the world so that He could give something to man. This world is not a place that is supposed to be struggle and strife and trouble all the time. We did that to us. We've done that to our descendants. Right? And unlike people who assume or they think, well, you're born with sin because Adam sinned and you inherit sin. No, but you inherit the consequences of sin. Your father sinned. It created a darkness in the world that wasn't there before he did it, and now you have to deal with that. We're talking about generational cursing here, right? Because that means that the sins you've done in this world, the consequences of those are going to affect your children. And the sins they do are going to affect their children. We don't inherit the sins, but we do have to put up with the consequences of them. The point that I'm making in all of this is that sometimes we look at the world like it's the enemy. But the world is the way it is because of what man has done. It wasn't designed to be this way. It wasn't designed to be hard. It wasn't designed to be hopeless. It wasn't designed to be immoral. It was designed to be beautiful and wonderful and perfect. It's so easy to be resentful when we have to deal with the consequences of someone else's actions. When we have to look at something that goes on in our life and recognize that it happened because somebody else did something wrong. Now, I'm not going to tell you that doesn't happen. It happens all the time. And it's really tough when it happens. But how many of us I've created problems for our children. I certainly know that I've had sins that have impacted my daughter, whether she recognizes it yet or not. And that's only going to get worse as time goes by unless I start addressing them, right? Here in chapter 3, he's actually covered a lot of very important topics. He's covered what it means to be the temple of God, that it means that you are so much more than just creatures put here to go through trial. That this world was given to you as a gift. And how are you using it? How are you treating that? This life that God has given you. But it was also given to everyone else. That we are all created in God's image. That we are all created to do the same work in the same kingdom. We are all called to follow one Lord, to be baptized in one baptism. We are called to unity, to understand that we are no better or worse than anyone else. We simply know something others don't know. And that's a travesty. It's something for us to be motivated by, to feel urgent about. Certainly not something to make us feel superior. There's nothing superior about us. I'm not better than the non-believer. I just know and have accepted something that they don't know or accept yet. Paints a very fine line, doesn't it? Yes, it means there's not a whole lot that separates me from the immoral people out in the world that do whatever they want. It shows the power of Christ. That is the only difference. My understanding of who Jesus is and what he did is the only difference between me and the evil out in the world. And that seems like such a fragile thing, but it shows us what a powerful thing that is. We need to be careful about how we see ourselves within our fellowship. That there's not a hierarchy in our minds. There are people that go and try to talk to certain individuals only because they feel like they're important. Sometimes you go to a church and they want to talk to the preacher every week after the sermon. Not because they need to say something or something was really important to them or any of that, but just because it makes them feel good to talk to the important person. And there's a flaw in that. Because I'm no more important than anyone else. The fact is, I'm not much of a preacher if there's nobody in this room to listen to me. Right? Then I'm not just a preacher, I'm just a psychotic talking to an empty room. There's not much of a church if all of you come and gather and sit in the chairs and you just sit there for 40 minutes in silence, looking to the front of the room. Probably not very productive, is it? We all have equal value. Our jobs look different. Our work looks different. But no one person is more important than the other. But more importantly, or equally as important, it's not my job to judge your work because I'm not called to your work. I can only assess my own. I am only qualified to look at myself and decide, did I do a good job this week? Did I do enough studying this week? Did I speak truth to people this week? Did I do God's word justice? It's not for me to decide whether I thought the song leader did a great job or whether the person leading a prayer did a great job or whether I really liked the devotional that was given for the Lord's Supper. It's not my job because I didn't do those things. Because at the end of the day, they've got to stand before God for what they said and what they did, and that's far more terrifying than anything I can offer. Be one, family. And for those of you that struggle, feeling like you're worth something, be encouraged. The church exists because of you. Without you, the church would be diminished. The kingdom would be diminished. You are as valuable as anything else. Scripture refers to you over and over as a precious gem or a pearl. God sees none of his creations as minuscule or unimportant or unvaluable. This morning, we make offer to those who struggle, for those who have need. If you need prayers, if you need words of encouragement from your shepherds, if you need reconciliation to God and to his children, whatever your needs are this morning, we ask that you bring those needs forward and make them known so we can help you see them met as we stand and sing.